Hello, everyone. I am Demetris Cheatham, and I am the Senior Director for Diversity and Inclusion Strategy at Github. I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you all about some amazing work we are doing with our corporate partners, foundations, nonprofit organizations, universities, and many of you here across the open source ecosystem. Today, I'm going to share a few things that we've learned so far about maintainers. Maintainers. Why maintainers? Well, after talking to so many people over the course of the past few months, here's what we've been hearing repeatedly. Inclusion happens at the community level. Whether someone feels welcome into open source, it really is dependent on those day-to-day interactions that they're having, those conversations online, those async communications, responses or lack thereof to pull requests and questions and issues and comments, not to mention those interactions that happen at events, whether virtual or in person. That's the place where inclusion or exclusion really happens. And what we've also heard is that the maintainer of that community, it really is there with that maintainer that drives the tone of inclusion in a community. You see, for those that may not be as familiar with open source communities, think of your maintainer to your community as a manager to a team in an organization or in a company. So they are the ones that have that direct influence on what's going on within that team or within that community. So we decided to really understand what the maintainers' experiences are, what their stories are, what's working, what's not working, what's some of the challenges that they're seeing with advancing diversity and inclusion within their communities. And we want to know what we can do to help them drive this even further. So with that, we've embarked on a maintainers listening tour. And one of my slides disappeared. So with the maintainers listening tour, this is a series of individual interviews, focus groups, as well as an async process for maintainers to provide information to us online. And so I have to put in a little bit of a shameless plug here. If you're at All Things Open, and even if you're online, we're going to be hosting a focus group tomorrow. So please make sure you check out your agenda and join us there. So let's talk about what we're seeing as far as the maintainers listening tour so far. That's what I'm going to share with you today. 6 things that we've actually been surprised about. So I want to say this. I'm sharing these with you. It's very preliminary. We're about halfway through the listening tour, so they're not absolute. We just want to hear if these things resonate with you. If you find something different, it might be a little bit more nuanced, so don't at me on this right now. Or if you do at me, just come at me so we can just have more of a dialogue. So the first thing that we've learned is about sponsored hackathons and community programs. So this is a classic case of intent versus impact. The intent of these programs is to provide opportunities for people who may be new to open source for them to do some meaningful contributions to communities. But what we've heard from maintainers is that these programs are a double-edged sword. Sometimes, and oftentimes, you'll have a company or organization that will sponsor these hackathons, and then all of a sudden you'll have tons of contributors, new contributors, that will descend on these communities. And it will then create a lot of work for these maintainers, where these maintainers then have to close out these requests, respond to these requests, and sometimes these aren't even the critical tasks that they would like to be focused on. And so again, this is what maintainers are saying. But this also creates a negative impact for those contributors that are part of these hackathons. Because if maintainers are really busy and it takes them a long time to respond to these requests and to really go through them, then these contributors are feeling like they're being ignored, they're invisible. And what we've learned is that that's one of the #1 ways where people do not feel included in open source. They don't feel welcome when they're making these pull requests, when they're asking questions, and no one responds. So you have that kind of negative interaction there. Another intent of these programs is to create a pathway for students to really contribute and, again, make meaningful contributions. But what we heard from maintainers is that a lot of the things that these contributors are doing aren't those critical tasks that they really need help with. And so they want to perhaps have a way that people know what those critical tasks are. There was one maintainer, she said, if there was a perfect world, if I had my wish list, those students and those participants would really come and help us work on those things that we need done to advance inclusion within our communities. They want them to help on things like making their code more inclusive, dealing with some of those non-inclusive terminology. They were like, that's where they would like to see a lot of those paid contributions. I want to make sure that you all do not leave here thinking that those programs are bad. As a matter of fact, they're excellent programmers. The maintainer said that. But we want you to think about it as a yes and. Yes, those programs are amazing, and we like to have greater partnership and collaboration. So if you are an organization or a company that sponsors these events, maybe work with the communities and those maintainers to understand what are those critical tasks that they need done. Have a targeted list of those communities that really are welcoming these students and these contributors that have the time and the bandwidth to respond. Because again, those paid contributors and that direct technical support, that's exactly what those communities said that they would love to see in those maintainers. Number 2, cross-community collaboration. This is something that maintainers really said that they hadn't thought about, but they can't figure out why they aren't doing this. I'll give you a prime example. We had a focus group a couple of weeks ago, and one of the smaller communities, they said, hey, we had this project that we were doing where it's about 80% complete. We were removing the dead names from our code, but the contributor that was working on it, they're no longer able to complete that project. As soon as that maintainer got it out of their mouths, another maintainer from a larger, more well-sourced community said, wait a minute, we've already done that. We had a group that worked on this for us. If you're 80% complete, we're gonna send folks over there and we're gonna do that for you. Consider it done. And in that moment, all of us started wondering, our projects collaborate with each other on code. Why don't we collaborate with each other on inclusion? It was just like a duh moment. Like, we should be sharing resources. We should be sharing contributors. We should be not only just documenting what we've done to increase inclusion, but we also should be lending that direct technical support where it's available. And so we just started seeing more and more maintainers working together now. So that's something that we've been really, really pleased to see and we're gonna work on, that cross-community collaboration. Number 3, what exactly are we trying to solve? So you always hear about this thing, and I actually hate when people are saying, like, what problem are we trying to solve? This is my own soapbox. I'm like, diversity and inclusion isn't a problem to be solved in the first place, right? But we found that we were thinking one way, that this is what we need to do. And throughout this maintainers listening tour, we found a few other things that's actually happening. So here's what we first started thinking, that communities need codes of conduct. You read so many research papers, so many surveys say, yes, that's one of the critical things that we need. Well, maintainers started telling us, we actually got our code of conduct. It's like most communities, especially that are part of those larger organizations, they already have code of conduct. What they really need are enforced code of conduct, as well as the training for when a community receives a code of conduct violation. Right now, if there's a code of conduct report, it goes to info at whatever website or email address. The maintainer or the group gets it, and they're like, we look at it and say, how do we deal with this now? They have no idea. They haven't been trained in intervention, de-escalation techniques. And actually, some of them said that they look at these reports and are like, they don't even see the issue. They're not even sure what the issue is. So they were like, we got our code of conduct. We need help with that next step. with how to enforce our code of conduct and what's the appropriate process for that. So that's something that we're going to be looking into. They also said we need to figure out how to turn new contributors into repeat contributors. That's what we were thinking. Like, hey, you have these folks that are coming to these communities, but then they're like, something's happening and then they leave. So we were like, we got to figure out how to get them to stay there. Well, maintainers said, we actually don't need them to stay there. That usually when someone comes into our community or into our project, it's because they've been working on something with our code and they found some type of bug or issue or security breach, and they come for the specific purpose to solve that thing. And once they worked on it and solved it, they're gone. And so really, they said it's only about the number that was thrown out there, like less than 5% of new contributors per year, that they actually want to stay in their community. They need help with identifying who those contributors are. That's that 5% that they can mentor and help them get on a path to community leadership. So they said we don't want widespread projects to start and keep these large numbers of contributors to our community. We're okay with them leaving. We need for you to help us identify those that are primed for community leadership. Speaking of community leadership, that's number 4. So we kicked off an open source diversity, equity, and inclusion survey with the Linux Foundation as part of this initiative. And so we asked the question, do you agree with this statement? There is a clear process to become a leader or maintainer in an open source project. Well, here's what our maintainers said. 56% of them said that they agree with this statement. So what did everybody else say that's not a maintainer? Only 36% said that. So if you're a maintainer, sure, there's a process because I became a maintainer. But if you're not a maintainer, it's very likely you have no clue how to become a maintainer. So we have to work on that and solve for that as well. And how do you solve for that? Through documentation. And that's the number 5 thing that we've learned. So let's see what that survey said around documentation. Open source projects I work on have process documentation in addition to technical documentation. This is the process documentation that talks about all those things that are critical to the success of a community, but not the actual code piece of it. And so let's see, maintainers said, oh, we got this. We got that process documentation. 72% agree with that statement. Let's see what everybody else said. Less than half. So maintainers, there's a perception versus reality thing here. So you might be thinking that you have this documentation, but everyone else is saying that it doesn't exist. So we have to work on that as well. Documentation is critically important, that process documentation. This is where all these important things happen. Your path to leadership. How do you become a new contributor or new to a community, or you've been contributing to a community and you're ready to advance? This sets the stage for that. How you can contribute. What we've heard from maintainers and new contributors alike is that sometimes they feel that the only way that they can contribute to a community is if they code. And if you're not an experienced coder, you're not welcome in that community. Well, maintainers said, no, there's tons of tasks that we need done. Well, you have to document them so that people know what they are. And then once you come into a new community, you have to look for that documentation so that you're contributing meaningfully at the right level. Make sure you document those critical tasks that need to get done. Remember I talked about the hackathons a little bit earlier? If you want those programs to focus on those critical tasks, you need to let people know what they are, and that's in that documentation. This next one is my favorite, the don't peek around the corner list. I call this the junk drawer list, like the junk drawer you have in your home. You know it's a mess, and this code in your community and your project is janky. You don't want anybody to touch it. You're gonna get to it one day, but right now you don't need anybody touching it, because if you start touching it, it will unravel a whole bunch of stuff that's gonna cause a lot of work for folks. And so they're like, don't touch that. Document that so that someone doesn't come into your community and into your project and starts fooling around in your junk drawer. And then this final one, which when I talked to maintainers, they said that if you were to prioritize these, this probably needs to be number one. Document clarity around the vision and goals of your community. Is this a short-term project? Is this a long-term project? Is this something that was just created for a specific purpose for a specific organization that you might not want to grow into a community? There are all sorts of reasons why people create things under open source licenses. Becoming a community might not be one of them. Maintainers, if this is the case, just document it and let us know so that we don't be trying to, jump in and get in there in your community, and that's really not what your intent is. So make sure you have clarity around your vision and goals. And finally, the number 6 thing that we've learned, all of the open source maintainers said that they needed to do a better job of expanding their personal networks. So what we've heard from maintainers is that, yes, they have these amazing events that are meant to drive inclusion. And then when we asked them, well, how do you get the word out about events? They were like, oh, we post it on LinkedIn and Twitter. Well, what does your network look like? It looks like me. Everybody looks like me in my network. So you're basically inviting the same people that are similarly situated over and over. Another maintainer had like this thought during the interview. They were like, you know what? All of the open source communities that I started, it was a result of me and my friends, sometimes family members, were sitting around and we decided to start a community together. So yeah, all of us are similarly situated, and then we'll go and get our friends who look like us, and they'll go get their friends who look like us, and then we have this very non-diverse community. So it started to have me thinking, and I was thinking about this, and then look what popped up on Twitter. Are we creating communities or are we creating cliques? Asking for a friend. And so maintainers said, yep, that's what we're doing. We're creating cliques. We're creating a lot of extracurricular activities, and we want to hang around with the people that are like us. But we're not serious about advancing inclusion if we don't do that, if we don't expand our networks. Like, we have to start with our personal networks before we start this artificial thing of creating this open source project that's diverse. So again, those are just 6 interesting things that we've learned. We picked up, again, not absolute. We're halfway through the maintainers listening tour. But now that we're learning about these things, what are we going to do about it? Well, this is where we've created an open source community called All In. All In is dedicated to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in open source by focusing on access, community, equity, and data. Have to do another shameless plug. I promise you, I think I got one more. Tomorrow, the keynote that I'll be delivering is more on All In. So make sure you tune in to that so I can tell you about the amazing work we're doing in addition to All In for maintainers. All In for maintainers will have a 12-month pilot. But we haven't decided what the pilot is going to be yet, because one of the things that we wanted to do was design All In for maintainers with maintainers, not for maintainers. And so that's why we're doing the maintainers listening tour and a whole host of other things. But here's what we're thinking. We want to make sure that we have inclusive development for community leaders. What does unconscious bias training look like for community leaders, not just generic unconscious bias? We want to start looking at something like the Chaos Project, and I see a lot of you representing Chaos here, that has the badging for events. What would it look like if we had a badge for communities, for maintainers, for projects who are not just saying they're committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but are actually doing the work? We want to display an all-in badge on their profiles. Free access to tools that advance inclusion. Whether you're talking about accessibility audits, inclusive naming, scans, your code scans, code of conduct analysis, these tools should be in the hands of everybody, but it can't be cost prohibitive. We've talked about inclusive language and code scans, accessibility audits, and the code of conduct analysis. Again, this is what maintainers said that they would love to see, and we're building into this program. Again, this is what we're thinking. What we need is help from all of you to help us build out this program. So here's where you can get involved. Go to our website, allinopensource.com. There's a big circle about halfway down that says Maintainers Listening Tour. Click there. If you are a maintainer, or if you're someone that has a reaction, good or bad, to anything that I've shared today, or if this is spurred on new ideas, we want to hear from you. We want to hear from you what you would like to see in a program like this. But again, this is your invitation to not only join me tomorrow, but right here today, please join us as we open source diversity and inclusion. Thank you.